Star Wars Battlefront 2 and Star Wars Battlefront 3. Will we ever stop talking about it? Probably not. Obviously, most of us are over the fact that yes, we're probably not getting a Battlefront 3, and no, Battlefront 2 is not going to be revived. Maybe someday we will get a new Battlefront game or something similar, at least a game to fill that multiplayer itch. But in the meantime, I wanted to dive back and talk about both Battlefront 2 and Battlefront 3 and share some behind the scenes stuff that I actually haven't talked about before. Because as a lot of you know, back when Battlefront 2 was in development, I was pretty close to some of the developers in the team. We met at a lot of events and they often shared ideas that they were working on and how they wanted to progress with the game. So I figured we could talk a little bit about that. Both Battlefront 2 stuff that never happened and that should have happened, and also Battlefront 3, how close were we actually to getting that? What really kind of made me dive back into the whole rabbit hole of Battlefront 2 and 3 again was this tweet by the Act Man that kind of went viral, or not viral, but it got a lot of likes, as people still really want to see another Battlefront. And I obviously retweeted this and agreed with him. But I did some digging and realized that this comment was actually from Dennis Branval, the design director, back in 2019, which is why he said Battlefront 3 is on ice as there's not the same hunger for a sequel. Which back then actually made total sense, because in 2019 that was the peak of Battlefront 2's live service.
The balance of the Force has been shaken. Clone Wars have begun.
So none of us really wanted a sequel. That was very true. We were getting a lot of cool stuff for Battlefront 2 and we just wanted that to continue and continue. Battlefront 3 wasn't really on the table or even discussed until it was announced that Battlefront 2 was gonna be shut down. Because prior to that, all of us, players and developers alike, just wanted to continue Battlefront 2. So that's where we'll start off this video. All the Battlefront 2 stuff that I know was discussed, prototyped, and that didn't actually end up in the game. Because I think we've seen a lot of developer comments over the years that they wanted to continue. After the game was shut down, most of the Battlefront developers actually left, and some of them have even gone out and said stuff like this, making it clear that they all wanted to continue working on Battlefront 2, and the transition over to Battlefield was not easy. So a lot of them decided to simply part ways with DICE. And in case you didn't know, Dennis actually started up his own development studio working on RPG games currently, and he hired over 10 or 15 of the old Battlefront developers because they all worked so well together that they wanted a new project to work on together. So what about Battlefront 2? And the stuff we didn't get. You've probably seen this tweet from a couple of years ago where Dennis did confirm that there may or may not have been prototypes of Mustafar, Ventress and Ahsoka for a Clone Wars drop following Scarif, which is obviously incredibly sad to hear, and also confirms that even though the developers probably knew the game was shutting down a couple of months ahead, it wasn't something they had planned for a long time. Otherwise, they wouldn't have made those prototypes if they didn't think they were gonna be able to ever release them. We've also had Guillaume, the hero designer, on my stream a while back, discuss some of the abilities he had actually planned for Ventress and Ahsoka and how it compared to the current mods that are out for Battlefront 2. Dennis also confirmed that they had Magna Guards up in a rough state and running, so obviously there was a lot of content they had planned to release after the Scarif update, but that was completely shut down by the higher-ups at DICE and EA. So what about other stuff that maybe hasn't been discussed publicly? Well, in my years meeting the developers, every time I met them, they usually had new ideas for how to make Battlefront 2 live on, because we all knew it wasn't a financially viable model that they had for Battlefront 2. They had to rip the entire monetization system out of the game and was left with basically only skins being monetizable, and those were also kind of screwed up because the currencies in the game meant that most players, like myself, had enough credits to buy every single skin in the game, even if I wanted to support the game financially. So it wasn't a financially viable model, and it was something that if the game was gonna live on even more years, would have to be addressed. And I know they had ideas for adding more cosmetic stuff, like star cards, the actual cards being unlockable cosmetics, and then making those star cards a bit more prominent, like in kill cam, highlights after the game and things like that, so you get to show off your cosmetics in a new way, like many other games do. I also do know that they considered the battle pass idea of whenever a new hero is released, if you buy the battle pass you can get the hero instantly, otherwise you're gonna have to wait for a few weeks. I personally really like this idea, as I feel like it still keeps all the content free. Just that if you're not willing to pay anything, you can simply wait a little bit to get the content. As long as you don't lock the content behind a paywall, I think that's completely fine. And I think one thing I also want to bring up is that people had a lot of willingness to spend money on this game. Considering how many hundreds if not thousands of hours many of us played, I would gladly chip in with a bit of money to support the development. One example of this is the Celebration Edition, which was released about half a year before they shut down the game. I do know that this edition sold many times more than EA actually planned or thought it would do, yet again showing how powerful this game was and how well a proper monetization system could work. Another idea that I also know was discussed in order to be able to make Battlefront 2 survive as a long-term game was annual expansion packs, a tactic where they would basically give us a little bit less free updates during the year, still enough that we would be occupied, but then once a year drop a massive annual expansion that would not be free. And whether this would be a Clone Wars expansion, an Old Republic expansion, or a Unknown Regions expansion is hard to say. There's obviously a crap ton of stuff in Star Wars that you could add into Battlefront 2. But I think this would also have been a great idea. It obviously had the risk of alienating people who did not buy the new expansions and would go back to the whole part of locking content behind a paywall. But if it would only be an annual thing, I still think it could work, especially coupled with all the free updates we would still get. It would at least have been a way better idea than doing the quarterly expansions with all the content being locked like they did for Battlefront 1. And these are just some of the examples that I know they discussed and thought about. They wanted to make Battlefront 2 a long-term project, and the lead team knew that in order to do that, they would have to tweak something with the monetization system to make it a viable project. And well, they had a lot of good ideas for it, and they were simply not allowed to implement them since EA and higher ups at DICE didn't want to make Battlefront 2 a long-term project, no matter how much the development team actually fought for that.
With the Battle on Scarif update, we've realized our vision with Star Wars Battlefront 2.
So what if you move on to Battlefront 3 then? After the team was told, no, you're no longer gonna be able to work on Battlefront 2. The next idea was obviously, can we make a Battlefront 3? And you've probably seen a lot of comments from people like Tom Henderson, who said that Battlefront 3 was a pitched title from DICE, but ultimately the title was shot down by EA due to licensing costs. It got turned down because it takes 20% more sales to make the same money, said one past developer. And there's probably some truth to this, but that 20% can also probably be made up by the fact that you sell 20% more, if not more, by the fact that you're making a Star Wars game. And there was actually a lot of plans on how they could make Battlefront 3 over at DICE. Dennis has also been out talking about this and straight out said in my 5-year anniversary stream for Battlefront 2 that he left DICE because they wouldn't let him do Battlefront 3. And we all know that the last update dropped in April 2020 and he left DICE in November 2020, which means that work on Battlefront 2 was probably done somewhere early 2020, I would imagine, as that usually concludes a while before the release is out, meaning that he spent maybe not a year, but at least 8 months or so, purely trying to pitch and make Battlefront 3 a reality. That's only my speculation, but based on the fact that he's talked about this and how much the team wanted Battlefront 3, I think they really gave this a go. He even went on to say that they did a few concept tests when they brought in real players that got to hear the game pitch from a neutral presenter and then criticize it while they were sitting behind glass walls, and that it rated really well, one of the most highly rated tests at a time. And most likely it rated way higher than Battlefield 2042 did, that's for sure. So overall, Dennis and the team really did what they could over at DICE to try and make Battlefront 3 a reality, and once Battlefront 2 could not happen and was shut down, they set the focus to the next thing, which was trying to make Battlefront 3 a reality. And it's clear when you read Dennis and other developers' comments that this was quite heartbreaking for them all. I mean, imagine being the ones actually working on this. Even if we thought it was hard as fans, I know for a fact that they were extremely passionate about Battlefront and all the work they had done on it. He said here that it was wonderful and heartbreaking and that it's taken quite a while to get over the frustration, but now I look back upon my entire stay with fondness and wish everyone nothing but the best. I had some kick-ass ideas for Battlefront 3 though. So yeah, I think the entire team probably shared that frustration of not getting to work on something they knew would be a huge success. I mean, we know that Battlefront 2 at one point had more players than all Battlefield games combined, yet EA did not see the reason to continue with the Battlefront franchise, which to this day still makes absolutely no sense. It's almost like Battlefront 2 in some way was the nail in the coffin for multiplayer Star Wars games. Despite the game making a turnaround from the worst game launch like ever into what I would say is the best Star Wars multiplayer game of all time. Yet after that, there has not been a single developer or publisher even daring to touch a multiplayer Star Wars game other than Star Wars Hunters, a mobile game which I don't even know if it's still gonna be able to release. And this makes absolutely no sense. If a developer were to look back and see the potential and success of Battlefront 2 and how big of a community and player base it generated, it feels like a no-brainer to create a new game. I do know that Battlefront and Battlefront 3 comes with its huge expectations on honestly a bit too much content, making it into a daunting and expensive project for any developer to take upon themselves. But honestly, I'm just missing that multiplayer Star Wars experience. It does not have to be Battlefront 3, it does not have to be as broad as a Battlefront game where it has single player, multiplayer, instant action, space, ground, heroes, and all that kind of stuff. I'd be fine with a game that focused on one or two of those parts and did it really well. I mean, that's basically what most Star Wars games are doing now. They're just doing flying like Squadrons, or they're just doing a single player story. And that's fine. It's just that Battlefront has those high expectations to have basically 4 games within one. But if we got a brand new franchise, a brand new Star Wars multiplayer game franchise focusing on a multiplayer shooter, or a hero shooter, or a looter shooter, or something like that, I am most confident it would do incredibly well if implemented in a good way, especially with all the Star Wars content coming out these days. There can be a constant flow of content to the game. Hell, just look at Fortnite, not even a Star Wars game, but that's as close as we get to a live service Star Wars game right now, as sad as that is. But yeah, I really enjoyed taking a look back at Battlefront 2 and the potential of Battlefront 3, and maybe sharing some behind the scenes stuff that you guys hadn't heard before. Star Wars games are still in for a bright future, it's just that multiplayer segment that is missing, as that really is what builds communities and something truly special, whereas a single player game is usually something you pick up, you play for a couple of weeks, and then you're done with it. So let's all have our fingers crossed that at least one company, publisher and developer sees this wide open gap and decides to fill it. Anyways, thank you guys very much for watching, and as always, may the Force be with you.